Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. We are going to talk about the world, current events, foreign policy, economics, world history, and other stuff. Today is May the 21st, 2023, and we're here to talk about the world, so let's jump into voice with Mr. Agent Smith. Smith. Hello?
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty good. Enjoying a nice chill Sunday. Got caught up with the chat on the stuff they want to hear about. People were all hyped for your return as usual. When's Agent Smith? We have a new fun baton method that makes it very interactive. So the first person who asks me when Agent Smith is happening is usually the first time I've thought about it, and then I'll text you. And then when you say sure, then I tell them, okay, he's confirmed and it's going to be at this time. Now the next time someone asks that, you have to answer it. And Dagnip is very good at this. If he shows up and I tell him, he's like, Agent Smith in 45 minutes, everyone. It's great. It saves me a lot of mental effort tracking all that.
Well, I'm glad some people are still interested.
Yeah, dude. Talking my ear off about it.
Did you have a good week?
I did. Yep, Guild is moving along as usual. Been playing a whole bunch of Dota 2. Stream's been doing well. We had some really big streams this past week. I did browse a little bit of the news to get some prep in. And got to read a lot of the funny Reddit comments responding to Putin declaring that Russia has taken Bakhmut. And a bunch of people were doing their armchair general thing and saying that it's a very strategically unimportant city that doesn't really lead into them taking anything else. And they kind of just shelled the crap out of the city. So they were laughing about him saying that they've liberated the city when they just kind of flattened it.
Yeah, it's a propaganda victory for Moscow, but it's not much in the way of strategic victory.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that much will really come of it. I think for the most part, people are still kind of focused on a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive, which is still for the moment in the offing. Yeah, it's probably not going to be as dramatic as people expect. I don't think it's going to be like a big breakthrough when they launch the offensive. You know, more likely it's going to be more of a series of incremental gains in localized areas all along the front, or at least in specific areas of the front. But the Ukrainian army probably hasn't had enough time to really build up enough force to really do like a big offensive that could really substantively challenge where the front lines are right now. But yeah, Bakhmut isn't going to play much role in that regardless.
There were people in the comments who were talking about other historical instances of places where you invest a whole bunch of resources to take a location and then it doesn't really end up changing much, but you dumped all the resources into it, and that's maybe another example of that sort of thing. Not exactly a Pyrrhic victory, but something sort of similar.
I mean, I think it's a pretty Pyrrhic victory for them. They don't have a lot to show for it. No, I mean, they did inflict a pretty decent amount of losses, and Russia is in a position to absorb losses better than Ukraine is, just given their quantitative advantage. But they didn't really start, they didn't get the kill-death ratio close to 1-to-1 until near the end of the battle. Maybe the past couple months. You know, for most of it, the Ukrainians were definitely inflicting a lot more casualties than they were taking. So the Russians took disproportionate casualties. You know, sometimes that's okay if you have some kind of key objective that you're trading that kind of disadvantage for. You know, if you can lose a lot more people than you kill or otherwise maim in a given battle, and it can be worth it if the battle results in some kind of overarching strategic victory. But that doesn't seem to be the case here. You know, so I mean, it'll go down in history as a big battle in the war, but for the most part, it seems to be mostly symbolic.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen analysts online argue that really Ukraine shouldn't even really be contesting it because it
Mm-hmm.
would be better for them, in their opinion, to just save the manpower. Rather than losing all the people that they lost in the battle for Bakhmut, they thought they would have been better served retreating to a more defendable position
Mm-hmm.
and then just trying to defend from there. So, in a sense, it was really more of a political battle than a strategic battle, in the sense that it was just more about the headline, right? Can Ukraine keep Bakhmut?
Mm-hmm.
And because the Ukrainians invested so much in it and kind of took on disproportionate importance, much greater than its strategic importance, in terms of its position on the battlefield. Like, I don't think Bakhmut is a major road or rail junction or anything, and it doesn't have substantive economic value in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, really it was just about propaganda for the most part.
What is the kind of main point of value of the city in general, like before it was shelled?
I think it's an old mining town. I think I remember reading that there was like some big salt caverns or something that were nearby.
Hmm.
But I don't think they've been producing much more recently.
There's a salty gamer joke in here somewhere. Yeah, so that was a thing. And then some of the other big stuff that people asked about. Paraguay has a new president.
Yeah. Yeah, they just had an election. It's I mean, Uruguay is not an explicitly authoritarian country, but it's had like one party in control for more than half a century now, thereabouts.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like a full liberal democracy either. It's more of an illiberal democracy overall, fairly corrupt in general. So I don't think anybody was really expecting much out of the election. The only reason it was in the news at all is because the opposition was polling unusually well for them. And so there seemed to be an outside chance that they might possibly win the election. But that was always going to be a heavy lift for them. Yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think the incumbent party was the Colorado Party, something like that. There's lots of Colorado parties in Latin America. That's a very common name.
Hmm.
But in Paraguay, I believe it's the principal political party in control of the country and has been for some time. Yeah, Paraguay is a fun little country. Very interesting history. But they'd never make the headlines. It's just a very small country and it's landlocked too. So
Mm-hmm.
you just never hear about it.
Yeah, access to sea is usually really good for trade. So being cut off means that you have to do rail or truck basically to move your big stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it's much more efficient. They do have access to a river, so they aren't like completely cut off from the ocean. They do have some access by way of the river.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but yeah, they don't have like they don't have any coastline per se.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the reason I remember reading about the Paraguayan election was because Taiwan was an issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because Paraguay was one of the few countries that was recognizing Taiwan and still does. And there was some question as to whether or not, if the opposition won, the new government might rescind recognition and recognize the mainland Chinese government as the legitimate government of China. But that didn't end up going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if they had won, like I doubt they would have done it. There probably would have been some pressure from both Taiwan and the United States to do otherwise. Yeah, Paraguay is not one of the countries in Latin America that China has a whole lot of influence in. relative to some of the bigger players like Peru or Brazil, Argentina, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the case of Paraguay, it's just kind of too small and poor. You know, I'm sure the Chinese government has done some Belt and Road stuff there, but I don't think it's all that much from what I remember.
What is their economy most based on?
I think two things. One, I think it's mostly agricultural.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of just food, stuff like that. I don't think it's mineral rich. So I don't think there's a lot of exports in that sense. So other than foodstuffs and other, forms of agricultural produce, the other big thing is I'm going to mispronounce the name, so I apologize in advance. I think it's called the Itapu Dam. And that's a dam built along excuse me, the eastern border of Paraguay is with Brazil. And the border is a river. It's like a major river. And so what happened is that they figured out that if they could build a hydroelectric dam on the river, it would generate a lot of electricity. But neither Brazil nor Paraguay could build it alone because the river was, again, the river was the border. And so if you ever want to do anything with a river that comprises a border between two states, you invariably have to cooperate. You have to cooperate with the other state in order to get anything done. And I think in the 60s or 70s, the Brazilian and Paraguayan governments got together and actually negotiated a deal by which Brazil would fund most of it, and in exchange, the Paraguayans would basically have to sell the electricity from the dam at subsidized prices, or at least their share of the electricity from the dam. Not subsidized, but discounted prices, rather. And that was like a 40, 50-year agreement or something. So, it's been in place for a long time. And the result is that while Paraguay does get the advantage of having relatively cheap electricity from the dam, the government isn't getting nearly as much revenue as they would be getting for it, if not for the discounted prices imposed as part of the agreement.
Mm.
So, but anyway, that dam actually just by itself is a good chunk of the economy, between the revenue it generates, the jobs it provides, and whatnot. Yeah, again, it doesn't take very many infrastructure. Well, I mean, an infrastructure project does not have to be all that big in a small country in order to be an important part of the economy. Like in the United States, it would be harder to do just because the overall economy is so much larger.
Mm.
But with a smaller country like Paraguay, like a project like that will be disproportionately important. Yeah, incidentally, the agreement on that dam deal is actually set to expire soon. And there's some question. Actually, one of the issues in the election, as I recall, was that they wanted the government, there was competition between the parties running about who would drive a harder deal with Brazil over higher prices for the electricity sold from the dam.
Huh. When did you say the deal ends?
I think it's like within the next couple of years. I don't remember exactly when it ends, but it should be pretty soon.
So then they'll get hella money.
They'll get more.
Mm.
I mean, given that it's a de facto one-party state, probably a lot of it will just end up getting stolen. But some of it might end up with the public.
Mm.
So there's hope in that sense, at least. Yeah, Paraguay was actually founded by. I mean, I shouldn't say founded per se, but the history of Paraguay basically begins with Jesuit missions. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with South American geography, but one of the big rivers, um, actually, I'm not even sure I can remember the river. It drains into the ocean at the Rio de la Plata in Argentina, and I guess technically also Uruguay. And then it kind of winds west and then north into the interior of Latin America, or South America, rather. And it's more kind of around the headwaters of that river that Paraguay is located. And so what happened is that Jesuit missionaries actually just traveled up the river, basically. And they just went deep into the interior of the continent, like way ahead of, advancing settlers or what have you. And they set up a bunch of missions and started converting the population. And they did it in kind of a different way than what you might think. I mean, here in the United States, we think of missionaries as being people who just go and live in a foreign community, and then they just try to get to know the people and just try to uh, ingratiate themselves with the locals and integrate with the locals such that the locals will listen to them when they talk about the gospel and why they should convert and all the benefits of doing so, etc. So Spanish, if not also Portuguese, missionaries had a different approach. What they would do is that they would actually travel into the interior, and they would actually create missions in which that were basically communes. They tried to get people to move into them and completely reorder their society basically around this sort of commune slash mission. And the Jesuits were so successful in Paraguay that they created like a whole series of these communes in the interior. And it was actually a very authoritarian setup. Like the Jesuit missionaries had a lot of power in those communes, and they were so ubiquitous in the region. They got to be so many that in some they actually got to be something of a minor power in the interior. Again, most of the population had been wiped out by disease already, so that's not saying much, but they were relatively more organized than some of the other Native American groups in the region, because it was natives they were, proselytizing among. The Jesuits themselves were largely Spanish, as I understand it, but the converts were all like native peoples there. And they were able to fend off, various attempts by slavers and, other adventurers of one sort or another to try to push into the region and abuse the locals. Yeah, somewhat, it's kind of counterintuitive, but there were actually Jesuit missionaries that actively fought against some of the other more exploitative Spanish actors that were in the region that were looking to abuse the natives, slavers in particular, but also just people who were trying to take land, speculate, what have you. So that kind of that helped protect the natives in the region to a degree, but the downside is that it really put the Jesuits on bad terms with a lot of the local governments, which did not particularly appreciate that kind of activity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Jesuits ended up getting outright banned from most of Latin America later on. Such was the dislike for the colonial authority for them. But those Jesuits ended up having a big influence on sort of the evolution of Paraguayan culture. They actually translated and wrote down the native language in the region, which I think was called Guarani. And that's actually still around. It's specifically because the Jesuits were able to kind of translate that and put it into a written form that they were able to kind of pass it down and standardize it. And to this day, it's actually one of the major languages of Paraguay, one of the official languages. And I think most of the population actually still speaks it, even today, which is kind of unusual for a lot of Latin America. Other than like, some of the, what do you call them? Some of the Andean groups, like the Andean Native American groups, like the Amaru or, what have I forget their names. It's been too long. But there's a couple large native groups that are still like very prominent and have retained a lot of their culture in the Andes. Mm-hmm. But other than them, you don't see a whole lot of, say, countries as a whole in South America where a native language is both an official language and is spoken by a very large percentage of the population. It's a little unusual. So you can thank the Jesuits for that. Yeah, later on, they ended up with you could say that the Jesuits also, another Jesuit legacy was sort of an authoritarian political culture to a degree, because they did end up later on with an extremely authoritarian government in the mid-19th century, relatively early on after independence from Spain. and I think his name was Lopez. I don't quite remember his full name, but he was able to significantly build up, well, not significantly, but he was able to develop Paraguay's industry, and he was able to ration the country's foreign exchange such that he was able to invest a lot into Paraguay's military. And what happened is that guy died, and then his son became dictator, and his son was a militarist. And he had big ambitions of expanding Paraguay's borders. Specifically, he wanted to expand to the ocean so that Paraguay would have a coast. And so he ended up going to war with Uruguay, I think. So the trouble that he had is that in order to kind of get to Uruguay, he had to go through Brazil. I hope I'm getting this right. Somebody from the region probably remembers the details better than I do, but basically, as a result of this effort, he ended up at war with Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. And that was called the War of the Triple Alliance. You know, if you look at a map, you can see how kind of lopsided that conflict ended up being. You know, Paraguay, not that big a country compared to those three neighbors. So at first, they actually did really well because Paraguay had been investing so much more in its army that they were a lot more ready for conflict than either of the three countries they went to war with. You know, the Brazilian government, the Argentine government, the Uruguayan government, all of them had not really been spending much on their armies. You know, they were very much in a peacetime mode. And so when Paraguay invaded them, there was a transition period in which they had to really scramble to mobilize their people and their militaries. And during that time, Paraguay was able to win some victories over them. But eventually, just the sheer weight of numbers and the larger economies in the region kind of won out. And the Paraguayans were pushed back into Paraguay, and Paraguay itself was eventually conquered. The dictator in question never surrendered. Like, after the country was conquered and the capital was taken, he took what was left of his army and started waging a guerrilla war against the armies of the Triple Alliance that were occupying Paraguay. And the result was an extremely violent counterinsurgency that wiped out a very large percentage of the population. I think it was something like 40%, maybe more. It was a lot.
Damn.
It's a huge chunk of the population. And Paraguay, I mean, you could say that it still hasn't even fully recovered even today, but you couldn't say that it recovered demographically for like half a century after that. Such was the damage. But eventually the war ended and Paraguay was able to start recovering. I think after the war it was largely it came under the influence of Argentina for the most part, because I remember reading that a lot of the big estates in Paraguay in the early 20th century were actually owned by Argentines. And I specifically remember seeing that referenced as a result of the war. You know, later on, there was a war with Bolivia in the early 20th century. I think that was in the 1930s. That was called the Gran Chaco War. Yeah, Paraguay is even smaller than it looks. Like, originally, if you cut the country in half, the southern half is what Paraguay originally was. And the northern half is a part of what's called the Chaco region. And that's sort of a semi-arid region between Paraguay and Bolivia that doesn't have a lot going for it. Like, the land isn't great quality. It's mostly empty. There's not a lot of rivers or anything, not a lot of mineral resources. So most countries actually just ignored it. And so it ended up being disputed territory that nobody really disputed in practice, but didn't want to give up on either. It was just sort of there. And it was not at issue until there was some oil discovered there. I don't think it was a lot of oil. And I think it ended up being not economical to extract it. So it never really went anywhere. But after it was discovered, there was renewed interest in the region. And the 1930s was a period of nationalism in the region, and in Bolivia and Paraguay especially. You know, I think in the lead up to the conflict, there was a new government that had come to power, a nationalist government. And they actually launched an expedition to find the body of President Lopez, who was the dictator during the War of the Triple Alliance. So, they hadn't been able, his sort of body and grave had been lost. And so they sent out an expedition to try to find it, which was kind of big news. And, the government made a lot of political capital out of that. They got a lot of popular support from that. And so when there was, when both countries, when Paraguay and Bolivia renewed the dispute over the Chaco, it wasn't long before a war broke out. And Paraguay pretty well overperformed, given the disparity in size between the countries. Paraguay did pretty well and basically won the war. There was some discontent that the war ended too early. Paraguay was making advances and then a ceasefire was called. And some people argue that they shouldn't have called a ceasefire. They should have just kept pushing until they had the entire Chaco. But in general, people were pretty overall pleased, with the course of the war. Not so much Bolivia. Losing the war turned into a big thing in Bolivia, helped delegitimize the government and created a lot of instability. Interestingly, later on in Paraguay, like a year or two later, there was actually a lot of people who blamed the government for the war. They won the war, but supposedly there had been issues with poor leadership. And again, there were people who were critical about the ceasefire. And so the government actually ended up not being able to glean as much support as it would have liked from the conflict. And that sort of renewed the cycle of nationalism, right? That after the war, even before the war, nationalism was sort of rising in Paraguay. And then after the war, there was a lot of soldiers, veterans, what have you, who were upset about the course of the war. And so they went out and started, protesting and whatnot. And so that led to even more nationalism.
Yeah, usually losing a war isn't the best way to build faith in your coalition.
No. Yeah, don't quite. Paraguay, I think in the 1940s, was part of the broader American alliance, specifically the Pan American Union, which the United States mobilized during the war to coordinate resources mostly. A lot of countries in the region, especially the Southern Cone region, were pretty skeptical about the United States. And they didn't really want to participate in the war. But the United States also came with a lot of money. They basically offering to buy all of the strategic resources they could buy in exchange for exclusivity. They wanted the South American countries to only sell to the United States because they didn't want them to sell to, the Axis powers. So, money will go a long way. They were quite happy to listen to that, even if they weren't as interested in defeating fascism. And Paraguay was in a similar boat. The government was very sort of nationalistic and very skeptical about the United States and sort of what they perceived as Yankee imperialism. But in between offering, to buy, everything they could export pretty much, and then also offering credits, specifically loans in exchange, in which they would be able to buy capital equipment or whatever they wanted in order to help develop their economy. They ended up participating, even in spite of the skepticism. And I think it was after World War II that the Civil War started. It was pretty brief. And it resulted in the rise to power of the Colorado Party, which has stayed in power since then, pretty much. Yeah, in general, people were getting increasingly upset with the nationalist government because, like a lot of nationalist one-party states, it gets authoritarian and arrests dissenters, opposition figures, what have you, and uses violence to suppress dissent generally. So, that rubs people the wrong way. And so the result is that some of the more liberal-minded officers in the army, as well as more liberal-minded folks in general, kind of allied themselves with other dissidents in Paraguayan society and rose up against the government. And it was pretty touch and go for a while. I remember there was actually one point when was it the rebels? Oh, I don't remember now. Somebody sailed up the river to the capital and attacked it. I think it was the rebels that did that. And the government forces really had to scramble to respond to that in time in order to assure the capital didn't fall. But they were able to actually pull it off. That is to say, the government forces were able to defeat the rebels. And so the authoritarian nationalist government was able to win out and enscone itself for the next half century plus. Yeah, one of the key figures in the battle for Asuncion, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, the capital of Paraguay. One of the key figures was an artilleryman, and he was able to play a big role in swinging the battle back for the government. And he ended up rising up the ranks politically very rapidly because, of course, he was quite popular amongst nationalists for the role he played, and he ended up becoming dictator himself later on. I don't remember his name; it's been too long, but he was in power for a good while.
Asuncion.
There you go.
There was a song that we had to learn in Spanish class where you would learn all the capitals of the countries in Latin America.
Oh, really?
Caracas, Venezuela. Bogota, Colombia. Quito, Ecuador. Lima, Peru. La Paz, Bolivia. Asunción, Paraguay. Montevideo, Uruguay. Got him.
I'm impressed.
Yeah. It's amazing what you learned in 4th grade.
I'm more amazed that you remember it all these years later.
Yeah, attaching the rhythm and the tonality to stuff makes it easier to stick in your memory.
There you go.
They knew what they were doing.
Smart folks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll throw out the usual disclaimer here early. I've been delaying it the last couple episodes. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully apparent at some times than others. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will see comments later. So feedback is very much appreciated in that sense.
It's catchy. I should release an EP of that. Hey, thanks. Yeah, in Texas, Spanish is one of your required classes in some schools.
Is it?
Yeah, at least in elementary school, we had to take at least 1 or 2 Spanish courses. I went to elementary in Louisville.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never heard that. I'm surprised they did that.
Mm-hmm.
That seems like the kind of thing that there would be a big backlash to.
Yeah. It might have been an opt-in. I don't exactly remember.
Yeah, I never had that. It was always there was like a language credit that was required in high school. I do remember that much, but definitely not elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
And even in high school, it was optional. That is to say, I shouldn't say it's optional. It's which language you studied was optional.
Yeah.
So Spanish obviously was the most popular one. But there were other options as well. I studied French because I was fancy.
Yep.
Spanish would have been a lot more useful in retrospect, but French was used a lot in. It was sort of the language of diplomacy for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I read historical stuff, about wars or trade or diplomacy, what have you, there were a lot of French words that kind of popped up. And so I wanted to learn the language to kind of make that literature a little more accessible, which ended up failing. It doesn't matter if you speak French as far as understanding, diplomatic technical terms. They're still just as, obtuse as if you didn't speak French. You've still got to learn. You basically have to just know diplomacy or study diplomacy in order to sort of learn what they're supposed to mean. But still, don't regret it. Useful knowledge, if nothing else. I could probably make my way in Montreal if I wanted to.
Yep. Où est la toilette?
Well, is there anything else exciting going on that you wanted to get to?
Yeah, I took some notes from chat. So someone wanted an update on the French workers' rights movement. They've been yelling about stuff. Has anything come of that? They said that it had been quiet in the news recently.
I mean, it's still going. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I still see videos from Reddit now and again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some protesters blocking something or burning something or doing whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But there's been no sign from the government that they're going to change tack.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the law has been passed and they've shown no willingness to reverse it. So no progress there. They're trying to keep up the pressure, but it's only going to get harder as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I'm pretty skeptical they'll be able to get what they want. Marine Le Pen, no doubt, is enjoying it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're kind of they changed their name. They used to be called the Front National, but they changed their name to something else, I think. But regardless, you know, that's sort of the predominant right-wing party in France is politically benefiting, you know, sort of from the unrest.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they can kind of, they're not really saying anything. They're not like being very belligerent about it, pointing fingers and whatnot, but they do note with some pleasure that Macron himself has seen a significant fall in his approval.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of the left wing forces in the country also have come under some opprobrium. So they're just kind of biding their time at this point. They're hoping that the landscape will remain beneficial for their cause until the next election. We'll see what happens. But for now, you know, not much has changed. You know, there's not really anything I can update on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I haven't been paying super close attention to it because I really don't expect the government to change course. And I don't really think there's much anybody can do about it. Protests would probably have to be considerably bigger and more disruptive than they have been in order to really even get the government to consider negotiating. And thus far, they haven't been able to do that.
So we'll see what happens on that front. And then there was another question about the Ecuadorian president dissolving the legislature.
Yeah, President Lasso.
Why did he do that?
He was about to be impeached.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, that's one way to get out of it.
Holding a vote to decide if the president will be impeached. Oh, wait, we've all been fired. Oh, damn.
Yeah, they're going to have another election pretty soon as a result. Yeah, his argumentation basically is that the charges are frivolous and that it should be up to the people to decide whether or not he should remain president.
Mm-hmm.
So, an artful political dodge on his part. Yeah, it was looking like the opposition had the votes to push him out. So, he'll probably have better odds of staying on with the election than if he'd just done nothing and waited to be impeached.
Mm-hmm. Interesting strategy going on there.
Yep.
And then there was also some people talking about the Greek election.
I'm surprised anybody cares.
Oh.
You know, everything I've read about Greece over the past 5 years has been about how sort of demoralized voters are and how little hope they have that anybody they'll vote for will actually implement any kind of change, you know, let alone positive change. So most likely there's not going to be any significant outcome there, regardless of who wins out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of Greece's politics are dominated by dynasties, sort of political figures who have, well, I should say political families, you know, families that have long histories in Greek politics and have built up significant patronage networks. Like, I remember reading that the principal conservative candidate in the upcoming election is like a scion of a dynasty that goes back like over 100 years, something like that, maybe even further. So they're quite well-known commodities in the country, but they're a lot better at playing politics than they are at actually governing. And the same can be said for most other political actors in Greece. On the plus side, the economy is growing again. So they got that going for them. There was some debating on Twitter about that. On the plus side, it's good that the economy is doing better. But it was noted that it only started getting better after like 5-10 years of austerity-induced recession, in which the economy shrank considerably and also real incomes shrank considerably, which has not had a great effect on the Greek populace, as you can imagine. So they're struggling a bit, but at least things are starting to look up, moving in a positive direction. But as far as the government, that's, every time I see anybody comment on it, from Greece, it's always just in the most despondent terms, like nothing's going to change, it doesn't matter, etc. So they don't seem particularly high on their options at this point. Yeah, unfortunately, political corruption has been a big feature in Greece from the start. And when I say start, I mean independence from the Ottoman Empire, way back in the early 1800s. There was a lot of discord within Greek politics after the war. Really, even during the war, there was a lot of, factional infighting. And that carried over into the post-independence period. And the result has been a lot of competition, very, difficult, stiff competition between elite families. And unfortunately, the main way that they were able to win and wield power was through patronage rather than by good governance. And Greece's economy and society have suffered for a very long time as a result.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Greece that I've seen is that the people have a lot of pride. I think there was a poll of like, these are the countries that believe that their country is the best in the world, and Greece was like really high up the list.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of that has to do with the long continuous history of the culture and that kind of stuff. So even if they're on a temporary downswing, they think highly of themselves and have pride.
Well, it's a very nice place to live. It's a very old culture. It's a culture that, very much induces people to be very supportive of friends and extended family. So, there's a lot of support networks in Greece that you may not necessarily see elsewhere. So that's a big advantage. And like you say, the history as well. It's just it's a very fabled society. They have a lot to be proud of.
Since the ancient days.
Since the ancient days, yeah. Unfortunately, they've never been particularly good at managing money. They didn't teach that in the ancient days. Pass it down.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you remember, maybe you were too young at the time, do you remember the 2004 Summer Olympics?
Athens?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the funny one about that for Americans was basically anyone that had some amount of Greek heritage played for Greece. So I just remember a whole bunch of American athletes that were playing for them or doing whatever their sports things are. Doing good events for Greece. They actually decided not to have them be the traditional way, which is butt naked. That's how the original Olympics were.
Well, unfortunately, tastes do change, don't they?
Yeah.
They spent a lot of money on those Olympics. They borrowed billions and billions of euros trying to get ready for them. It wasn't the only thing they borrowed money for, but it was definitely sort of indicative of just how much money that they were borrowing so readily. And over time, that just built up to an unsustainable degree. Really it was the money borrowing that was driving the economy by that point. By the time the Eurozone crisis happened, there was a considerable amount of debt in Greece, and there was no real way they were going to pay it off. Yeah, it would have been better if they defaulted. I think in retrospect, everybody kind of agrees on that. Or maybe even better, negotiated settlement, but it was pretty clear that wasn't happening. So in lieu of that, default probably would have been the better option. So it goes. Yeah, the Eurozone crisis kind of is debated as though it were an economic crisis, but really it was a political crisis. Germany in particular wanted to bail out banks after the 2008 financial crisis. But they couldn't really do that without buying up significant shares of Greek sovereign debt. And if the German government owned all that debt, then invariably there would be pressure on them to try to take a haircut. That is to say, to forgive some of the debt, if not all of it, in order to help out the Greek government, which was struggling, in the wake of the global financial crisis. And so there was a lot of debate about whether or not it would be better, for the debt to be forgiven, or for it to be, reformed, to be kind of extended and to be turned over, etc. Mm-hmm. And all of that was very much with a mind for economic growth, like what would be best for the Greek economy, how could they grow their economy such that they could pay off all this debt, whatnot. But that was that was a misreading of the problem, because fundamentally the problem was not about how to save the Greek economy. Fundamentally, the problem was political, because again, the German government wanted to help the banks, specifically German banks, but they knew that they couldn't do that without pissing off the German public, which by and large did not want to do that. And so when they did it anyway, they needed to have something to show for it. They needed to show that all of that money was not just going to go to waste. That is to say, just going to be pissed away and never to be seen again. And that put the German government in a corner, right? They could not really forgive any of that debt that they'd gotten from, they could not forgive any of Greece's debt without aggravating the German body politic. But then they also couldn't just sort of not do that, right? Because again, we saw what happened as a result of austerity, right? It was just years of recession, low economic growth, and the Greek government ended up having that debt be reformed anyway. Reformed isn't the right word. Somebody in chat knows what it is. It slips my mind at the moment. Renegotiated or whatever it is. But so the German government didn't, it was stuck between a rock and a hard place. And they ended up going more with they ended up trying to focus more on the politics within Germany rather than the economic issue represented by austerity. And that was that did significant damage to the Greek economy correspondingly. But there wasn't really much alternative. The only other alternative was default. And there was actually a point when the German Minister of Finance, actually just kind of came out and said that he would prefer if the Greek government just defaulted on the debt. They kept asking for it to be renegotiated, but they didn't actually want to default because that would have locked them out of markets and done damage basically to the Greek financial system. And while that's true, it also would have just dealt with the problem of the debt. Like if they just default, then they can pay a sharp short-term cost and they can start recovering. But they didn't do that. And so they did just 10 years of austerity instead, which not only was bad for the Greek economy, but it also really drew out the political crisis within Germany. Because the whole time that was happening, people were complaining about the German government having bailed out Greece and having wasted all of this money. So everybody was unhappy. It was a total clusterfuck. And it was really born out of a lot of false expectations from the 90s more than anything. It was known that it would be a problem if European governments borrowed too much money after they joined the Eurozone. And there was a push to try to have fiscal restrictions. There was supposed to be a maximum fiscal deficit you could have, and countries were supposed to maintain their debts. That is to say, the ratio of debt to GDP within a certain range. But even though those restrictions were adopted, they were not enforced. And the result is that a lot of states like Greece, including like Italy, Spain, what have you, ended up borrowing more and more money. And I think the expectation in the 90s was that eventually there would be some kind of bust in which they would finally hit a wall and not be able to borrow any more money. And I think the assumption was that when that point was reached, then the governments in question would have no choice but to implement structural economic reforms that would make their economies more competitive and generate the kind of economic growth they needed to get their finances on a more sustainable footing. And it turns out that was an immensely charitable assumption, because that is not what happened. Pretty much every government in the region, even after they hit the wall, after the global financial crisis and found themselves increasingly locked out of skeptical markets, they did not want to implement those reforms. And instead, they focused a lot more on lobbying the European Union and Germany in particular to try to implement some kind of pain-sharing mechanism like, say, Euro bonds or whatever. Basically a debt-sharing scheme in which some of the debt load that was being carried by those countries would be shared by countries in Europe that had much less debt and that were generally surplus countries in the sense that they were exporting more than they were importing. That's never been popular in Germany either. So that was never realistically going to happen. And the result was just a deadlock. Like, there was no obvious path forward. And they got stuck in negotiations for years trying to figure out a way out of it. In the end, there were some minor concessions. They did adopt a kind of watered down version of Euro bonds, but it wasn't really what the south of Europe, the southern countries like Greece had wanted. And ultimately, austerity was the main solution. Like, they just expected them to gut government spending and direct relatively more finances toward debt, which again was like not the economic optimum choice. Like, that was not the way. That's not a good way to really grow a struggling economy. But again, it was a political crisis, not an economic crisis. That solution, however economically damaging, was the most politically viable from the perspective of German leadership. And so it really should not have been a surprise that that was the way things played out. Even a lot of Greek middle class folks really didn't comprehend that. That was sort of the reason why Syriza ended up getting elected. Syriza was a sort of populist left-wing party, and they won. They ran on a platform of challenging the European Union, the Troika, basically the three main owners of Greek debt, who the Greeks were trying to get to renegotiate their debt. I think, what was it? It was the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Union, I think. Somebody can correct me in chat if I got that wrong, but I think that's what the Troika was. And Syriza was elected specifically to go to the Troika and say, you either renegotiate this debt or we're going to default on it. And the idea there was that the Troika would be more averse to a default by Greece than they would be to a renegotiation of the debt. And they ended up being wrong. And the Troika called their bluff when they did that. And the Greek government went home empty-handed. And a lot of people were pretty surprised by that. And the reason was that the Troika honestly preferred default. Again, that would have solved the problem. It would have been worse for Greece in the short term, but it also would have just resolved the issue finally. The Germans could have said to their voters, hey, it's not our fault the Greeks defaulted. We couldn't have known they would do that. And also, they could have said there's nothing they could do about it. So the money's just gone and it's the Greeks' fault. And then the Greeks could have said, well, it's the Germans' fault. So everybody's ass would have been politically covered. And all of the politicians could have gone home relatively happy. Voters would have been screwed in terms of economic performance, jobs, incomes, etc. But it would have been a short, sharp pain rather than a just prolonged agony like what we ended up getting. So people kind of had to learn the hard way in Greece. And, I would add that it was specifically because of the failure of the Syriza government that a lot of people in Greece got really turned off of politics. They've kind of been pretty jaded for a long time, but the failure of that government in particular to resolve that crisis really dented a lot of the morale in the country. And the sense I get is that the country hasn't really fully recovered from that and may not yet for some time.
Yep. Faith in an institution or government is a fickle thing. You make a big fuck up, and then it's going to take a while to earn that back.
Yeah, unfortunately so.
There was some talk in the chat about it being similar to the USA situation. I guess there's a negotiating our debt ceiling thing that it feels like this happens every few years and there's always a big to-do about it, and then stuff just ends up going back to normal after people are being a stick in the mud about something or other.
Yeah, that's been in the news a good bit. It's different than the Eurozone crisis. The Eurozone crisis had to do with, again, just bad assumptions in the 90s. Like, they just didn't design the Eurozone as an institution very well. They were just assuming that there would be problems later on that would auto-correct, right? That would just resolve themselves, and they did not. And still have not, by the way. The Greek government has still not implemented broad-based structural economic reforms in the country. They have resisted that tooth and nail, even though that was one of the core requirements that were negotiated as a result of renegotiation of the Greek debt, which happened later on, much later after all of the drama in the Eurozone crisis. But in the case of the United States, the institutions in question, they're well designed, robust. The issue is the actors that are using them. If people want to screw up your institutions, you really can't stop them. There's only so many features that you can design into an institution to mitigate the probability of institutional failure that you can do. But ultimately, it's a dynamic game. Like, you can only ever take a defensive position, right? To kind of use military or, let's say StarCraft terms. Institutions are like fixed to defensive positions. Like, if somebody really wants to overrun them, all they have to do is study them long enough and find the weaknesses, and then you're screwed. So long as they can, get enough of the support or whatever else they need to do it. So that's how institutions work, right? There's only so many mechanisms that you can design in. Eventually there comes a point when you just have to hope and trust that the people in those institutions are not going to find ways to abuse them and abuse loopholes and abuse flaws and other things that are invariably going to exist. And that's kind of the problem right now. There are actors, who either because of opportunism, or because of genuine ideological beliefs, think that challenging the government on the debt ceiling and holding the country's finances hostage is the best way to get what they want. And it's very unfortunate, because that's not really how a healthy liberal democracy should address issues like this. But regardless of whether it's good or bad, it's definitely happening. And so there's nothing institutionally, or at least there's very little institutionally we can do about that, unless you want to get into like a broader argument about the electoral system and the representativeness of the overall U.S. government at the federal level. That's kind of a bigger debate. But more specifically, I think it's fundamentally different than the Eurozone crisis because of that. The Eurozone crisis, I mean, they're similar in that they're both political in nature. I guess I would grant that similarity, but the Eurozone crisis was a crisis between countries, and that really had to do with a relatively new institution, that being the European Union and the Eurozone, whereas the United States has older institutions, but newer, more radical actors using them. Yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, the Biden administration has been negotiating with House and Senate Republicans over some kind of deal. It's difficult to judge how that's going. Supposedly the talks ended, because the Republicans walked away, but then they came back. So there's a lot of negotiating bullshit happening, little tricks here and there that people try to use to get leverage over each other. And I think the Biden administration was talking about the 14th Amendment? Something to that effect. Basically, there's sort of a clause and an amendment. I think it's the 14th Amendment, in which it is said that the government's debt what is it, like the sanctity or whatever of the government's finances cannot be abridged. It's got some weird fancy language in it. But from what I was listening to on the radio, because I'm old, is that the clause was originally written into that amendment because there was concern after the American Civil War that if former Confederate states were allowed back into the Union, they would elect politicians that hated the United States, for forcing them to rejoin the Union, and that one of the ways they might express that resentment and try to get revenge on the United States as a country was by sabotaging the national debt. And there was sufficient concern over that they wrote that clause. The government, whatever else it does, cannot violate or otherwise undermine the nation's credit, basically. Mm-hmm. So there's some debate about how relevant that is here, or whether the government can actually overturn, whether the administrative state, the Biden administration, could unilaterally cite that as an excuse to just pay off the nation's debt, regardless of what Congress says about the debt ceiling. So, there are some legal arguments in favor, but it would probably be politically incendiary, to put it mildly, if the administration did go forward with that. Mm. So I think right now they're mostly just using it as a negotiating tactic, just trying to use it as leverage, saying to the Republican Party, basically, you need to give us a deal, and if you don't, then we're just going to ignore you and go with the 14th Amendment thing.
There was a question that was a follow-up from a previous discussion about that, quote, moderate person who flip-flopped parties named Tricia Cotham, the NC State rep.
Yeah, she voted for the abortion thing, right? That's what they're asking about, I bet.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, there was a lot of people were really upset about that, and we talked about it too. I was saying that I was going to reserve judgment because she was elected. For those of you who are not up to date on this story, there was what state was it?
New York.
New York, really? I thought it was in the South.
Oh, NC, North Carolina. Sorry, misread it.
Oh, okay. It scared me. He blew my mind for a minute there. It's like, really, New York? Yeah, North Carolina. Okay. So there was a woman who ran in a relatively tight election. Well, no, it wasn't a title. It was a relatively blue district, and she was running for a seat in North Carolina's lower house. I don't know if they call it the House of Representatives there, but basically the lower house of their legislature. And, it was closer than people kind of gave it credit for. The district has kind of gone back and forth between Republicans and Democrats over time. And there was like a progressive candidate that ran and lost in the primary. So, there is reason to believe that it's a more centrist district. But anyway, she won as a Democrat. And it was expected that she would vote, against abortion restrictions and whatnot. But then she ended up flipping parties. She left the Democratic Party and then joined the Republican Party. And, some people thought, she was like a traitor or she was bribed. But, I made the point that, and, also other people, not just me, that it didn't necessarily mean that she would change the way she voted on issues. The party is just a label, and it may be that she's going to be consistent, that she's conservative on some things and then liberal on others. So, I reserve judgment as to just what the significance of her shift in party affiliation would actually be and whether it would actually have any significant impact on policy. And so more recently, there was a bill that was passed restricting abortion, and they actually had to override a veto by the governor of North Carolina in order to get it passed. And I think it was the override of the veto, which required a very large majority, and they only had, what was it? They had there was a margin of one. Basically, they only passed it by one vote. It was a very, very slim majority, just barely over the line. And so people were and she voted for that law. She voted for the law and she voted to overturn the veto. And so people looked at that and said, okay, so this is betrayal. She is changing the way she was going to vote. Mm-hmm. So there is some truth to that, it would seem. I'm still a little dubious. It's not as though there are no conservatives in the district, given how the voting went, at least how the voting has gone historically, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be that and probably given that it's North Carolina, there probably are a lot of socially conservative Democrats in the state. So it's not as though opposition to abortion is exclusively a one-party thing in conservative states like the South. So I would concede that there's more evidence now that her changing party has affected the vote and has affected policy. But I still don't know that she's necessarily being inconsistent with her own beliefs or with those of her constituents. And I would point out that that is subject to debate, and I would welcome feedback on that as well. I would be curious what people thought about that.
Yeah, Chad is saying that she ran on pro-choice, which seems
She
like
ran on pro-choice. Okay.
yeah, which
So
seems
that's-
like a bait and switch.
So that's important context then.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure what she's up to then.
Yeah.
If it is a predominantly Democratic district, then she's not going to get reelected, especially if it's mostly a pro-choice district. But it could be that it's not. It could be that the margin is closer, and maybe she thinks she can win being sort of a center-right Republican. So maybe she's got relatively more liberal views than most of the state, and she's hoping to build a coalition between conservatives in her district and people who are more moderate Democrats, perhaps. But we'll see. The more information I get about it, the more it seems like she did a complete 180. So I'm not sure what the logic is there. Maybe the GOP there in the state just recognized that they needed that one additional vote and decided to kind of make her a deal of some kind. But I'm not sure what kind of deal it would have been.
Yeah, pretty weird. I think a lot of people just wouldn't like that conceptually when you're doing what looks like flip-flopping from side to side based on... Because a person's personal beliefs, I feel like, on issues like abortion don't really change that much. That's one of the reasons why it's not a normal, like, dinner table conversation topic that I would go for if I have a mixture of conservative and progressive friends. Like, that would be one of the worst ones to go for because you have basically zero chance of anyone giving any ground in either direction. So for a person to change their perspective on that, it's kind of like, how and why did this happen? Don't really know. But it's interesting.
Yeah, she was saying when she flipped that she was getting a lot of criticism and pressure from the Democratic Party and a lot of criticism from Democratic voters that she didn't like. She felt like they were getting too aggressive and that she was not getting sufficient room in order to voice opposition or criticism to some policies that the party was in favor of. So supposedly that was why, but that doesn't necessarily explain why she would run pro-choice and then switch.
Yeah.
I would point out that North Carolina has a very high degree of partisanship. There's a lot of political competition in the state right now and has been for maybe 5 to 10 years. It used to be a solidly Republican state, but there's been a lot of population growth in urban centers, specifically Charlotte, which is like this big deregulated banking center in the South. And then also the Research Triangle, which is sort of the Raleigh-Durham area, which is where the capital is, but they've also got, I think, some educational institutions. And there's also been a lot of tech and other sort of more advanced type economic activity that's built up over time in that area. So with the growth in the urban population, the balance of power between relatively more liberal urban voters and the rural conservative voters has become more balanced. And because neither side really has a big advantage and are relatively even keeled in power, the result is that every vote is like on a knife's edge. Like just a couple of votes can swing outcomes dramatically. So in that sense, there is a lot of incentive on the part of, say, the Republican Party or for the Democratic Party, for that matter, to try and get votes however they can. In a less competitive state, there would be less incentive to do it, and you probably wouldn't see stuff like that. Like people switching parties for whatever reason. It would probably be not as attractive an option. But in a hyper competitive state that's still like in the middle of a transition from one dominant political group to another, there's a lot of fighting. Everybody's kind of fighting and scrapping for every vote. Every political battle is like existential, and everything is just hyped up to the nth degree. So yeah, it's been pretty radical in North Carolina. There's been a number of stories to that effect over time. Yeah, I think it was North Carolina where they had I don't remember what it was. I think the Republican Party had a control of what was it, like the lower house or something, and they were going to have a vote on some controversial legislation. And so the Democrats had enough votes to prevent it from being passed. But the trouble was, the Republicans said that they're not going to hold the vote on a certain day. Instead, they were going to go on recess. And so everybody left, but then the Republicans in secret agreed amongst themselves that they would actually come in during the recess and then convene a session and then vote without the Democrats there. And because they did that, they were actually able to get it passed, whereas otherwise they would not have.
Secret vote.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that was North Carolina. It might have been a different state, but that's what I'm remembering. But anyway, that's an example of the kind of hyper-partisan shenanigans that ideologues get up to in battleground states like North Carolina. And so that's sort of I think that's also important context in which to understand this lady's, supposed defection. It's not like it happened in an environment where everything is sort of peachy keen in terms of relations between the parties. There's like an extreme amount of competition between them. Mm-hmm. So the idea that the Republican Party might have gone out of their way to try to sway her from the Democratic Party, or for that matter, that the Democratic Party may have just alienated her. It may be that her explanation is accurate. Either explanation could be true, but it's perfectly feasible given the degree of competition in the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you want to be a politician that's extremely sought after, go run in a battleground state, and then both sides really want your vote.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you can see similar dynamics in Virginia, which is just to the north of North Carolina. This is all kind of old news to most Americans, I feel. So, I hope this is kind of interest to some of our non-American listeners, because they probably don't hear a lot about state politics in the U.S. So, hopefully they find that intriguing, but and not boring. But in Virginia, they have a similar dynamic. In the case of Virginia, the fact that the state is becoming relatively more liberal has to do with Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. Washington, D.C. has grown tremendously over time, and the result is that there's an increasing sprawl of suburbs around the city. And, if you look at a map, you can see that Washington is right on the border between Maryland and Virginia. And so as the city has grown and as the suburbs of the city have sprawled out, increasingly those suburbs have sprawled out into Northern Virginia, to the point now where there's a huge population of suburbanites, just Washington suburbanites, who are now Virginia citizens and have been voting, in Virginia state elections. And being Denzians of a large city, they tend to lean relatively towards the political left of the spectrum, more so than a lot of the traditional rural constituents of the state do. And the result has been a significant amount of political churn in the state, because the rural population is very, very much at odds with the kinds of people that are working in Washington, D.C. They tend to be a lot more educated. They tend to come from outside the state. Like, there really could not be more of a culture clash between them. Yeah, I remember one good case in point of that was gun legislation. I don't remember if it happened after a mass shooting or not, but we get so many, it could well have been. Mm-hmm. But there was a push by the governor in particular to try to get some gun legislation passed. And there was a huge amount of controversy over that. You know, conservatives in the state were absolutely apoplectic over the prospect of gun regulation being passed in their state. And there were actually real threats of violence made by some more radical conservatives, you know, to go and try to assassinate him or to try to raid the Capitol or do something. And there were actually, I believe, arrests over that ahead of the vote. So another example of hyperpartisanship. I would point out too, and this will be obvious for Americans, but hopefully informative for non-Americans listening. Most states in the United States are not like that. So do keep that in mind. Not every state is like a battle for ideological life or death. Most states have a pretty clear majority of one party over another. And so politics tend to be relatively more subdued.
Yeah, if people are all on the same page, then they're kind of looking at things through the same lens and they have the same values that they're working from. So there isn't nearly as much friction, which also means that people aren't as hostile to their neighbor just because they're all on the same page. My parents moved from Western Washington, which is very much a progressive bastion in the U.S., to South Dakota, which is a conservative bastion. And they're more with, quote, their people, where it's other people who are conservatives, they're Christian, they kind of think about the world in the same way. So they're respected in that sense. But yeah, these states where it's a battleground, it would be interesting to be there because I haven't really lived in a battleground state. I was in Georgia for 6 months, but I was just heads down training StarCraft, so I wasn't politically engaged there. I did get a text message like 3 days ago because I have a Texas phone number, and they wanted me to stand for the security of the Texas border and support this bill for some extra verification of people or whatever. It's like, wow. I'm still getting those political advertisements in the text message.
Oh, yeah. Texas GOP goes hard.
Yeah.
They've got a very proficient machine working down there.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard of the Greater Idaho movement?
No, but that sounds like they want to take the Eastern Washingtonians.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think mostly it's something pushed by some of the conservative counties in the eastern part of Washington.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much interest there is, say, in Idaho to do that, but you know, there is some traction there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the weird thing to me is I've seen people, you know, there's been articles on Reddit, and I read it and I see the comments. And, you know, I find it interesting how sort of weirdly opposed to it a lot of people in the western part of the state are.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not really sure what the why they would necessarily be opposed to that, because losing those counties would only just improve their hold over the state, would it not?
Yes, it would. But it doesn't look as good on a map when you lose that territory.
Doesn't it, though? I mean, look at the northeastern U.S. Most of those states are like oddly shaped and tiny.
Yeah, but
so why not Western Washington?
Well, okay, I'm going to pull up a map of Washington real quick. And people can see what we're working with here. So there's this amazing feature called the Cascade Range. And these are mountains, but for like culture and politics and whatever, this is like a left versus right divide. So this eastern side of the state is more arid and dry because the rainfall doesn't make it over from the Pacific Ocean to the eastern side. There's quite a bit of concentrated population in the Tri-Cities area over here, but overall the population density of this eastern half is way less than here. Like you have all these really dense like tech hub cities. There's a lot of trade and stuff because you have access to the ocean, like key harbors, there's naval bases and stuff, like a whole bunch of action over here. And it is very, very progressive. This side is very conservative, but then you've got kind of the middle of the state, which has a bit of column A, a bit of column B. But yeah, I don't think, like if you're thinking about the overall influence of a state, wouldn't you want to be relatively larger but still have a majority? Because Washington State has a very strong left-leaning majority even with Eastern Washington attached to it. So like what would they gain by having a more left-leaning state? I think it'll be
Larger
mostly the same.
majority. You could amend the Constitution, perhaps, to a degree you couldn't otherwise,
Yeah, I guess so.
because that generally requires a supermajority.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they have a supermajority right now in the state, do they?
What constitutes a supermajority?
Well, it varies depending on state. I think generally it's at least greater than 2/3, if not 4/5.
Mm-hmm.
So something in that range, basically.
Yeah, it could be. I don't think Western Washington, if that was the full Washington, I don't know what they would lose in terms of resources. There is a lot of really good farmland and stuff kind of in the center of the state before it gets super dry. Like this Columbia Plateau is like pretty much pure desert, but a lot of farms like Walla Walla, Washington, super famous for apple farming and stuff. So yeah, they would lose a bit of their agriculture if they lost Eastern Washington.
Well, define lose.
Revenue, tax revenue. I don't know how the state taxes farming and stuff like that. It is a relatively low tax state because we don't have income tax, state income tax anyway.
And invariably, most of the income for as far as state revenue is going to come from the more urban areas anyway.
Yeah.
And that also doesn't take into account the fact that the government is going to spend a lot of money on those rural areas as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not losing much in tax revenue, and you're getting the benefit of not having to, you're getting the benefit of not having to expend resources on those areas.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really, it probably won't have a dramatic impact on total revenue one way or the other, I would assume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe.
And you can still, go ahead.
Maybe it is just pride why you want to keep the whole state.
Yeah, I kind of get the impression that's more what it comes down to. Some of the people in the Reddit comments kind of indicated as much.
Yeah. Well, that was one of our theories for why Putin would want to run into like eastern Ukraine, because it doesn't really seem like it's a super dense area of resources that you're going to take and then capitalize on. Like, yeah, there's some stuff, but for the cost of the war, it's not a net positive that would happen during his lifespan. But for the way that the map looks, that would look like you have a lot more control area. But you also have Siberia, which is area that not many people want to set up in.
Unfortunately not.
No.
That's pretty rough. That's pretty rough territory. And there was a big outflow of people from Siberia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot of the reason there were population centers there at all was because the Soviet government went out of their way to try to subsidize and set up industries there so that the region could industrialize to some degree.
Mm.
But those subsidies went away after the government collapsed, and after that, the regions kind of had to live or die on their own merits, their own comparative advantage.
Mm.
And a lot of places just didn't have it.
Mm.
A lot of people lost good chunks of their population as a result. So basically, there's no reason to oppose the Idaho movement, at least not like a big tangible reason, near as I can tell. It just seems like people, I mean, I should point out that broadly speaking, it doesn't seem to have a lot of support anyway. It seems to be something that sort of the more ideologically motivated parts of the population are interested in. And most people don't give a shit. Most people are not like so invested in politics that they're willing to really do a lot about it unless they're directly affected somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, even if the idea of breaking up Washington and, turning Eastern Washington into Lebensraum for Idaho, even if that's weird, it seems like opposing it is perhaps just as weird. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason to oppose or support it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of adding or joining the Union, there was a question asking about Puerto Rico's vote on statehood. I think that's something that has come up a few times.
Are they doing that again?
I think they're doing that again.
Why?
Well, for those who haven't followed it, why is it something that you would say why to? because they already have a beneficial relationship and it wouldn't really improve that much?
I mean, the main advantage of being a state is that it's easier to default on debt, of which Puerto Rico has like a lot. Right now, it's not really, there's not like a clear way to do that. Like if they did default, there's not a legal mechanism by which the debt can be sort of renegotiated. So they could just default on it, really. They could just drop it entirely, but that would have like dire sort of fiscal consequences. They would rather not do that. It would be easier to just become a state and then renegotiate it that way, or to get perhaps more resources from the federal government. You know, those are generally the arguments in favor of statehood. Then the arguments against statehood are generally that they have privileges by being a territory. For example, people in Puerto Rico don't have to pay income taxes, I believe. Is that correct? Let me check that. I don't want to make shit up. Oh, so they do have, well, they have their own income taxes, but do they have, let me ask Chad. Chad, does Puerto Rico have to pay federal income taxes? I don't think they do. Puerto Rico residents are also required to pay US federal taxes, but most residents do not have to pay federal personal income tax. Okay. So says Google, so make of that what you will. So there are certain tax advantages to remaining a territory. They also have a little more discretion in terms of some policy areas than states do. The disadvantage is that the federal government does technically retain the discretion to kind of intervene in the territory's governance under certain circumstances. When it was clear that this territory was on the brink of defaulting on its debt, Washington actually stepped in and basically took control of the territory's budget and imposed not insignificant austerity measures as a result, which of course were very unpopular. So, you know, if they were a state or independent for that matter, that would not have happened. So generally, these votes happen every so often. It used to be they only happened like maybe once every 10, 20 years, but these votes and referendums have become increasingly frequent over the past 20 years in particular. And that's mostly because the pro-statehood faction of Puerto Rico's politics has become increasingly agitated, you know, with the state of the territory's finances. And also there's, you know, some upset over a perceived lack of response by federal emergency services in the United States. You know, FEMA is alleged to have been somewhat laggard in the response to various hurricanes that have hit Puerto Rico. Doesn't help that a lot of people in the mainland U.S. don't even know that Puerto Rico is a part of the United States. You'd think they'd learn by now, but apparently no. Apparently they just think it's some Caribbean country. Yeah, in general, sorry, go ahead.
What are the other territories that are not states? Like the U.S. Virgin Islands is one.
We've got a whole bunch of unincorporated territories that are basically just rocks in the ocean. I can't remember all of them, but you know, places like Wake Island, Howland Island, what's it, atoll? I don't, we've got a couple of atolls. Probably one of my favorites is Navassa Island, which is in the Caribbean. It's actually sort of like between Haiti and Cuba or something. And it's literally just a giant rock. And the last time I checked the population on the island, it was like 2 feral goats. Something like that, you know, there no people or anything.
2 feral goats in a bush.
Yeah, it's very, very small. So we've got a bunch of territories like that. And then we've got some like weird territories like Guantanamo Bay, which are of kind of a legally dubious status. Technically, that's territory that is sovereign Cuban territory that is being leased to the United States. The Cubans have said that they want to end that arrangement. They've been saying that pretty consistently since the revolution in 1959. But the way that the agreement was originally written before the revolution was that the lease could only be terminated by consent of both parties. And of course, the United States government has not consented. So the result is that the Cuban government is stuck leasing, quote unquote, leasing land to the United States that it very much does not want to. It's even funnier when you consider that the terms of the deal do actually involve rent. The United States government is obligated to pay rent as part of the agreement. And the United States government has actually continued to pay that rent to Cuba, but Cuba does not want to accept that rent because that would tacitly, legally speaking, indicate acceptance of the terms of the lease. And so the United States pays them and they refuse to accept. And so all of that money for half a century now is just accumulating in a bank account that is technically owned, that is supposed to go towards the Cuban government. So an extremely passive aggressive leasing agreement there that the United States has with Cuba. So that's another example of a territory. The District of Columbia is another weird example. That's kind of an outlier because that was a specially designated territory created specifically for the construction of the capital of the United States. It wasn't clear where the capital would be after the United States broke off from Britain. It was thought that if it was in any one particular state, then that state's government would be able to pressure the federal government and then maybe sway national outcomes. And so it was determined that the best way to do it would be to have a neutral territory that did not belong to any state where the capital could be constructed. And so that's how District of Columbia was originally made. Fun trivia for those of you maybe not familiar with the District of Columbia. The territory was originally a perfect square. And if you look at it, it is not a perfect square today. And the reason is that the square that made up the District of Columbia originally was comprised of land donated for the purpose by both the states of Maryland and Virginia. And what happened is during the American Civil War, the state of Virginia actually seized that land back and restored it to their sovereign control. And the funny thing is, even after the Civil War, that land was not returned. So the result was that the District of Columbia lost its southern half, roughly, the chunk that's south of the Potomac River. So that's the District of Columbia. Now, in the case of Puerto Rico, that's what's called an incorporated territory. And we do have a couple examples like that. One of them is the Northern Mariana Islands. Guam is another one. You've probably heard of Guam, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the Northern Mariana Islands are to the north of Guam. Actually, the Northern Mariana Islands and Guam are all part of the Mariana Island chain, so it's all just one big island chain. Guam, I think, is just the largest island in that chain and the southernmost. But all of that is U.S. territory. Let's see. Northern Marianas, Guam, Puerto Rico. Another example would be Samoa, or American Samoa, as it's sometimes called. That's kind of a weird example, though, because that's technically an unincorporated territory, which is weird. Normally unincorporated territories are territories that have no population or minimal population. But in the case of American Samoa, they actually do have a population around like 60,000 people, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So they have more than enough to be an incorporated territory, but for some reason that I don't understand, nobody's gotten around to actually making it an incorporated territory. Anyway, that's legal mumbo jumbo. It is a territory of the United States. It is sovereign American territory, and it is also a unique territory because I think in every other case there was a lot of Spanish influence, like the Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, and Puerto Rico. All of those had significant Spanish cultural influence. Samoa is pretty much the only major American overseas territory that does not have significant Spanish influence. The Samoan culture is really its own thing. Yeah, it's a pretty neat place. Big giant people.
Mm-hmm.
Samoans tend to be on the bigger side. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I watched a like fitness breakdown of the different types of humans and the different advantages and edges that they have depending on what their genetic profile is. And they did mention Pacific Islanders as being really fast to cultivate mass because they needed to store energy for the long sea journeys that they used to take. Because it takes a long time to like raft from the mainland of Asia to any of the Pacific Islands and whatnot. So people who were better at being able to store energy for those long journeys were going to be a lot better off and more survivable.
That's pretty interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, they mentioned that China does really well at powerlifting because they tend to be a smaller statured people, which means that the like fulcrum, I don't know the exact physics of it, but you don't need to move the weight as much for your body weight if you are shorter in stature. So being shorter is a advantage for powerlifting, and China usually has really heavy representation for like Olympic powerlifting events.
Yeah. Oh, that's pretty wild.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, China in general is not like a sporting powerhouse, so I hadn't realized that they did have a niche there.
Mm-hmm.
Other than ping pong, anyway.
Yeah.
It's always been very popular. Yeah, in general, in Puerto Rico, the balance of power is generally in favor of the status quo. You know, there used to be an independence movement, but it was never all that popular. And right now it has relatively minimal support. So at this point, it's basically status quo forces versus statehood.
Mm-hmm.
And statehood tends to be pretty powerful, but they've never been able to overcome the status quo vote. And the result has been deadlock, effectively. You know, basically, the pro-statehood faction in the territory's politics has gone out of its way to keep trying to engineer a referendum in which they can try to engineer a result before the result that they want. So they'll do. I think one of the examples was they had one referendum that was a two-tier vote. Right? They had one vote, one question basically about whether or not you were okay with the status quo or not. And a lot of people are not okay with the status quo. They recognize that there are problems and that something should change, but so that was an easy one. So most people said yes to that. But then in the second vote, they gave people the option of independence or statehood. So there was no option for status quo in that case. And so that was a way of basically pooling people together in a way that you can kind of say that statehood won the vote when really they did not.
Mm-hmm.
If you whenever there's been a straight referendum in Puerto Rico between statehood, status quo, and independence, status quo has consistently won. And generally in polling, that's the choice that polls the best.
Mm-hmm.
But that hasn't stopped the statehood folks. They keep trying, to find some kind of way to force the issue and make Puerto Rico a state. And it just keeps not working. So I did find an article talking a little bit about, apparently there is another referendum that is set to be held in 2023. Unless there's been a change in public sentiment in Puerto Rico, it probably will not result in statehood. Regardless of how they try to design the referendum, it's probably not going to work. Statehood, independence, free association, that would be interesting.
What does free association entail?
That's basically independence, but with very close ties to the United States. We actually have a free association agreement with several Pacific Island nations in the Pacific. So they're independent countries, but because they have a free association compact with the United States, that is to say the United States is responsible for their defense and also for their foreign policy. Also, their citizens have the right to travel freely to the United States, so they don't need visas or anything. Mm-hmm. And also vice versa, American citizens, I believe, can travel there without a visa. But beyond that, sovereign territory. They gave up a lot of sovereignty as a part of that agreement, but they do have their own laws. They are not subject to the U.S. Constitution, etc. So pretty close to being a territory, but not technically territory.
Mm-hmm.
So in Puerto Rico's case, they would retain a lot of the benefits of being a territory, but would also get the benefits of being independent. So that might be a preferable outcome to people who want the status quo. And November 2023. That should be interesting. Yeah, generally votes are not binding. A binding vote would require, well, I should say that a binding vote that actually results in action by the Congress of the United States, it would have to be recognized either before or after the fact by Congress. That is to say, if the Puerto Ricans voted for statehood, then the Congress would have to recognize that and act on it on its own initiative, or before an election, Congress would have to vote to legally bind the U.S. Congress to recognize the vote's outcome in Puerto Rico. So one way or the other, Congress would be responsible for actually operationalizing, the outcome of the vote. But generally, Puerto Rico itself has not made the votes binding. That is to say, generally, the Puerto Rican government has not said that whatever the outcome of this vote is going to be, the Puerto Rican government will thereafter be bound to push for that result with Congress. That is to say, if people voted for statehood in the election, the Puerto Rican government would be bound to ask the U.S. government to act on it. But that could change. It looks like the Congress might actually vote to make the referendum binding, which is to say the Congress would automatically recognize the legitimacy of the vote and the outcome and would act on it. So if they did do that, there could be relatively quick action depending on the outcome. I still don't think statehood's going to win, but we'll see.
There are certainly some people who are about it.
I'll have to read more about that. Yeah, Puerto Rico used to have a pretty good economy. What happened in the mid 20th century is that there was a bill passed in Congress that gave special tax. Well, basically, it made Puerto Rico a tax haven of a sort. Puerto Rico was able to benefit from, well, not tax haven. That's not the right. Subsidies. The Congress actually gave tax credits to companies that relocated to Puerto Rico. I think that's what it was. And the result was that a lot of pharmaceutical firms actually relocated their manufacturing to the island. And so there was a couple of decades where Puerto Rico's economy was relatively robust on the back of pharmaceutical production. But then later on, I think in the 90s, that congressional legislation was actually ended, or more specifically, the tax credits were ended. And the result is that a lot of those companies ended up leaving, and Puerto Rico thereafter lost its comparative advantage and was not able to replace it with anything. And so the outcome since then has been that the Puerto Rican economy has just been in a dire state. Like they haven't been able to generate significant economic growth or generate new economic activity. They're a little bit hamstrung too, because technically they are subject to minimum wage, that is to say, federal minimum wage. And in most of the United States, federal minimum wage is not very high. It's very low. But in the case of Puerto Rico, because it's relatively undeveloped economically, federal minimum wage is actually probably a bit higher than it should be. It makes labor in Puerto Rico uncompetitive. If not for that, they would be able to, I don't want to say people would be able to get lower wages. Obviously, that's not something people want. But in terms of economic competitiveness for a relatively undeveloped territory, one of the main advantages you have is low wages. So, if they did not have to adhere to the federal minimum wage, and if lower wages were allowed, there probably would be greater economic activity.
Well, yeah, because for the business owner, if you have to pay your employees more, then that means less for your bottom line. It's a more expensive operation overall. For the employee, the minimum wage can be good because that means that you have some amount that people think is close to what you could live off of. I think the federal minimum wage isn't really meant to be a living wage per se. I don't think you can pay rent in most places with minimum wage.
Hmm. Yeah, but you can do it with, I think in Puerto Rico, the cost of living is much lower.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you basically, if you make the minimum wage too high, it prices out a lot of just normal economic activity that smaller producers and entrepreneurs can't afford.
Mm-hmm.
They basically just can't afford normal labor because their income is not correspondent to the cost of labor.
Mm-hmm.
If the minimum wage up in up in the mainland in the United States is sufficiently low that it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Most people make higher than minimum wage, generally, depending on where they live, since states have their own minimum wage too. So no, there are no businesses that are getting priced out of production because they can't afford labor that is artificially overpriced. But in Puerto Rico, they do. That's the issue. It also doesn't help that there's also some unemployment benefits that are relatively generous. Given relative to relative to the development of the economy, uh, relative to how developed the economy is, the unemployment benefits are relatively generous. And so the impact of that is that reservation wages are relatively high, which is to say that it often makes more sense not to work than to work. At least work is disincentivized.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, you want to strike a balance between unemployment benefits and median wages, such that people are getting enough in order to cover their costs while they're searching for a job, but not so high that they're disincentivized from trying to get another job, which would pay more, or at least an equal amount in benefits. So Puerto Rico, if it were independent, would not have those problems. Minimum wage and unemployment benefits would be lower, which in general is not great for labor, but would make the territory more economically competitive. They
Mm-hmm.
would be able to attract more business. Relatively more businesses would be able to set up, and they would be able to afford the labor such that they could produce, whatever. It would just be more workable, basically.
Mm-hmm.
As is, they're just stuck between a rock and a hard place, and it doesn't really make sense from a public policy standpoint.
To state or not to state? That is what they're asking.
Yeah, it would be pretty wild if they did become a state, because that would really kind of test the assumption that, you know, a lot of people in the United States, maybe not most, but a lot of people in the United States assume that Puerto Rico would vote Democrat because it's a predominantly Hispanic state. It's like
Mm-hmm.
95% Hispanic or whatever. And that's not necessarily true, right?
Mm-hmm.
For one, it's a fairly socially conservative state, which suggests that Republicans would at least be competitive there. But it's not even inevitable that the state is going to vote more for economically left policies. The politics in the state kind of bear that out. So it could well be that the state splits between the Democrats and the Republicans, or even swings Republican, depending on how attractive voters in the state, in the prospective state, find the GOP's message.
I thought you were going to say how attractive the voters are.
Well, the Caribbean does have some fairly attractive people.
Yeah.
Who's to say? Oh, what other form of excitement do we have?
I think we covered all the main items. Oh no, there was another one about asking about startups that are selling drones and military equipment to the U.S. government. I think that's kind of how our military works anyway, where you have companies that are like Lockheed Martin able to make like super high-end military stuff, and then they compete with each other, and then the U.S. government ends up buying heavy contracts of that kind of stuff. But I guess startups in Silicon Valley are now trying to get in on that in some capacity. Did you see anything about that?
I haven't seen anything about it. I'm not surprised by it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how notable it really is.
Mm-hmm.
In general, there's been a lot of tension between the military and Silicon Valley, or perhaps more broadly, the American tech sector in general. Because a lot of tech firms do not like working with the US military. The military's contracting is very slow. It does not leave a lot of recourse for, say, disagreements or breach of contract. Never do business with the government, as the old saying goes.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the tech sector just finds it a lot easier to just stick with the private sector and not deal with the public sector substantively.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Also, working with the military means that you have to do a lot of confidentiality stuff. The military, if you're going to develop new technology for the military, or develop proprietary technology for the military, they want that very hush hush, right? Just for national security reasons. But if you're a tech firm developing new technology, you're going to make a lot more money scaling it up and selling to the private sector than you will just selling it to the military.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, spending the resources to develop software that you're only going to be able to sell to a extremely narrow segment of the market does not really make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so that tends to be a sore point for the military, which wants to cooperate with the tech sector in the United States to develop new technologies, new software, what have you. But finds that vanishingly few partners step forward from that sector to take up those kinds of contracts. So in that sense, Silicon Valley perhaps, well, specifically the startup scene in Silicon Valley, in that sense, that scene actually producing some actors willing to cooperate with the military and take on some contracts could itself be notable, but generally that's not drones. That's kind of what surprised me. Most of the tension between the military and the tech sector has more to do with firms like Google or other sort of software firms, not so much the hardware firms. The guys who actually make drones and stuff, I had not thought had been refraining from doing business with the army, or the military, rather. So I'm not sure what's necessarily newsworthy about that, per se.
Mm.
But then I don't follow it all that closely. So, maybe the poster knows something, maybe the questioner, rather, knows something I don't about it, in which case I would be very interested to hear feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but my intuition is that it's not that big a deal. Like you said, the private sector sells to the military all the time, and especially in terms of hardware,
Yeah.
it's not that unusual.
There was also a question about any political challenges to the two frontrunners in the U.S. election, Biden and Trump. We know DeSantis is someone who's had his name out there a lot, but I think recently you were saying he wasn't polling super great.
No. Last I checked, he was like 20 points behind or something. Yeah, it was a big disadvantage. But DeSantis, as far as I know, is the only other major serious opposition to Trump. There's probably going to be some never Trumpers that pop in and try to make their case, but just given where American politics are right now, I doubt they're going to make it very far.
Mm-hmm.
So, if Trump wants it, it's pretty much his to lose, unless he does something stupid, which is entirely possible. Unless he does something stupid, then he'll probably get the nomination. That seems to be where we are right now. Things could change, but where we are right now is that Trump looks like a relatively safe bet.
Mm-hmm.
And as for Biden and the Democrats, I don't think I've heard of anybody stepping up to run yet. I suspect there's going to be, given that Biden has announced he wants to run again, the party is going to probably discourage people from running against him because they're probably already pretty paranoid about his prospects against Trump. So they probably want to go out of their way to produce a united front going into the election.
Yeah.
They want to try to make sure everybody's on the same page and everybody's working together, pushing the same message and staying focused on the goal of making sure that America's premier populist politician does not get his second term.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not the Democratic Party can actually do that, that remains to be seen. A lot of people, especially on the progressive left, in the Democratic political coalition are not particularly happy with Biden or his administration. So it remains to be seen whether or not they can be sufficiently mobilized to turn out to vote in 2020 and have the desired impact. We shall see.
Yeah, so we might see a battle for the oldest man in America, round 2.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's the 21st century. It's quite the freak show.
Yeah.
No surprises in that sense.
We live in silly times.
Did you see JFK Jr. was running?
Yeah, someone in the chat, not today, but recently, was very hyped about that, but in sort of a conspiracy theory kind of way.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's his campaign platform, pretty much.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Which kind of stuff is he into? Lizard people, QAnon, the bundle deal?
I haven't followed all of it, but he seems more almost like a soft Trump type guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't follow the kookier ones, at least not lately. So I'm not up to date on what shenanigans he's been up to. I'm not, I don't think he's going to be like a serious candidate. At least I doubt it. You know, knock on wood, we'll see. We'll see what new bizarre disrata emerges from the 2024 election. But for now, given precedent, I do not think that he would be a competitive candidate. We doing okay on time?
Yeah, I got about 40 minutes.
Gotcha. Let's see. Was there anything else you wanted to kind of get to, or?
Man, the news is just like super garbage from what I was looking at. It's like anytime it says slams in the title, it's going to be a junk quality article because someone slammed someone else, which means they used harsh words, which could be, as you've called it, performative outrage. It could be any number of things that aren't actually a change that's occurring that is noteworthy that we need to learn about. It's just this person opposed this person in some way with words.
Yeah.
Who's that other guy who's always in the news? It's not DeSantis. George Santos? Is that the guy?
Oh,
yeah.
God. Yeah, he was in the news again.
Yeah, people are talking about him in the headlines very often. I don't really follow him or know what he's about and stuff, but apparently he's one of those characters that a lot of people really dislike.
Yeah, he lied a lot when he was running for office about his background, and it didn't come out until after he'd won office that was the case. But technically, he had not done anything explicitly illegal. It was just, it seemed extremely unethical. But then more recently, he got in trouble again for something. He was actually arrested, I think, more recently. Some kind of money thing. Yeah, I don't recall the details myself. There are too many clowns in U.S. Congress to really follow all of them.
Wow, what a quote.
So I can't really be expected to track all of their shenanigans. So I try to economize my time by trying to focus on substantive changes in the balance between this, that, or the other faction.
That's pretty great.
But yeah, he's been arrested. I'm sure the media will get some interesting articles out of him, but I don't think it's going to impact political outcomes that much. Let's see. Well, did you hear about Pakistan at all? Did I talk about Pakistan last time?
I don't think so.
Okay. Have you seen it in the news at all?
No, what happened?
So Imran Khan was arrested. I don't know how much you remember from the last time we talked about it, but Pakistan has had running mass protests of varying degrees. They kind of wax and wane with time, but they've had protests since the impeachment of Imran Khan from the office of prime minister in Pakistan. And in his stead, one of the rival political parties, the Muslim League Nawaz, was basically given control of the government. And, you know, all of this is happening in the background of the military souring on Imran Khan. You know, to give you some background, Khan is actually a former professional cricket player. And he's very famous in Pakistan, has been for a long time. And I think it was after he retired back in the 90s, he started his own political party. And it was sort of a reformist party. You know, they were all about fighting corruption and, you know, trying to achieve more democracy in Pakistan, you know, that kind of stuff. But he was also seen as kind of a jock. You know, he wasn't seen like as a particularly viable political leader. So he was a perennial also ran as a result. You know, he was always kind of around, but he was never able to win much. But then, what was it? It was like 4 or 5 years ago, whenever it was, his party was actually able to win a majority, and he was actually able to form a coalition government. And, you know, you can't really prove that he was working with the military while he was running for office, but there's been a lot of persistent rumors to that effect. Mm-hmm. And the military is the most powerful political force in Pakistan, so it doesn't seem all that likely that he would be able to run for office on a reformist platform without having some kind of tacit support from the military. So he was able to kind of govern Pakistan with a kind of understanding, at least, with the army. But eventually there was a falling out. You know, eventually, what I remember is that Khan wanted to appoint his own guy as chief of the army. I think that's what maybe it was chief of the general staff. I don't quite remember, but normally the army basically selects its own leader. You know, the guy in charge of its overall operations. And Imran Khan was apparently lobbying for a specific guy that the army did not want. And, you know, there was never much danger of the army not getting the guy that they wanted. Imran Khan was not in a position to force the issue, but the fact that he was running against the army's interests was enough to cause the army to turn on him. And the result was increasingly virulent protests against Imran Khan, mostly by Islamist parties that are sort of implicitly known to be not necessarily controlled, but sort of allied with the Pakistani army. And there were a bunch of charges levied by the judiciary, you know, targeting Imran Khan for this, that, or the other financial chicanery. Maybe true, maybe not. Difficult to say. You know, the political culture in Pakistan is very tolerant of corruption. So it's not unusual for politicians to engage in corrupt activities of one sort or another. But at the same time, the fact that corruption is so ubiquitous means that generally anti-corruption drives or prosecutions are generally only done for political reasons. In other words, when you do see a conviction, it's not because the judiciary has suddenly found a conscience. It's because this, that, or the other political faction is looking to strike a blow against a rival faction. So in this case, the army wanted Imran Khan out. The judiciary went after him. They found sufficient grounds. He was impeached, thrown out. His rival, Nawaz Sharif, was brought in as prime minister. And that should have been the end of it. You know, just going by Pakistani history, that's certainly what the army seems to have been hoping. But Imran Khan refused to quit. And he said instead that he would fight to be returned to his office, you know, to be returned to the prime ministership. And he mobilized his supporters, as well as anybody else who would listen, to go out onto the streets and protest against the government. And he's been keeping that up for 2 years or so now, for a while. It's not a recent development. But much to the chagrin of the army, one of the recent developments, I think last year, or maybe early this year, I don't remember which, there were provincial elections in Punjab, and these were the first major elections in the country since Imran Khan had been thrown out. And no doubt the military was hoping that, Nawaz Sharif would be able to win, because normally Punjab is more of a stronghold for the Muslim League in, which is Nawaz Sharif's party. But as it happens, Imran Khan won the province, and everybody was quite surprised by that. Probably not least of which was Imran Khan. So at this point, Imran Khan's support goes beyond his normal constituents. It seems to have expanded to a broader part of the population that is tired of corrupt patronage style politics and wants something resembling an improvement in that regard in the country. And apparently, they do believe Imran Khan is the guy to do that. So since then, Imran Khan has continued to kind of tour the country to try to mobilize his base, proselytize people to the cause, get more people protesting, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, what happened, what was it, a couple weeks ago, the government finally said, fuck it, you're under arrest. That had kind of been in the cards. There was already a court case that had been launched against him, specifically having to do something over an allotment of land. Again, not unusual for politicians to be corrupt, so it could be like totally legitimate that he misused funds to one degree or another. But the fact that they're going after him in particular is telling. Regardless, the court case is ongoing. They had been letting him go. They had refused to detain him. But eventually the judiciary changed its mind and issued an arrest warrant, whereupon I think it was the military, maybe it was the police, but regardless, he was finally arrested and brought in. And people flipped the fuck out. The protests just snowballed even more after that. And there was even a protest that, what was it? He went to the residence, that's what it was, in the city of Lahore. They went to a Corps commander's residence in Lahore and just ransacked it. Damn. So, Corps commander is just the commander of a corps in the army. So that's not like the highest level, but that is a flag officer. That's a high level dude. And normally those guys are pretty well beyond reproach. So the fact that protesters targeted his house and ransacked it was a pretty big escalation. Yeah, apparently there was footage of people smashing chandeliers and stealing peacocks, apparently.
What? Like the animal?
That's what I said. What? Yeah, it's like a fancy animal, so some of the richer people in the country will buy them.
Never heard of that.
Yeah, they tend to make a lot of noise. I've also heard of them being used for pest control.
I think you told me about that guy in Hawaii who beat a peacock because he was annoyed at how noisy they were or something.
I don't remember that, but that could have been one of mine. That sounds like something I would talk about.
Yeah, when you get to the weird, silly stuff.
Yeah, they have a very distinctive cry. If you heard it, you would probably immediately recognize it, because I bet you've heard it before. But yeah, they also eat like rats and bugs and snakes and things. So, if you've got a chicken coop or something, they can be nice. They can be a nice counter in that sense. Yeah, my aunt actually used to have one. We went down to her ranch for maybe not even a ranch. It's just like a plot of land out in like rural Texas. But we went down there for Thanksgiving one year, and yeah, I walked outside, and then suddenly there was just a peacock walking in front of me. I had no idea. Nobody told me. Nobody warned me that there was a peacock there. There it was. It was just suddenly there. And I was just sort of stunned into silence. Like, what the hell is this thing doing here?
Why are you here?
Yeah, she's made some weird purchases. Yeah, I think her recent one was alpacas for some reason.
Yeah, those I've seen on farms quite a bit.
Yeah, I think you can shear them. Is that right?
Yeah, kind of like sheep, and get wool from them. And
Very
they're
weird
also
animals.
pretty protective and territorial, so they double as like donkeys, where if you have other creatures like coyotes that are trying to prey on your smaller creatures on a farm, like eat your chickens or something, the alpacas will just beat the shit out of them. So
interesting. I'd never heard of that.
Yeah, they're pretty defensive and territorial. I actually got to meet some at a place called the Gentle Barn in California, visiting with Trisha. It's rescue animals and stuff like that, and they had, I think, 3 alpacas there. And for one of the male ones, they were like, his name's King, don't touch him. But the other ones, you can pet them and they're fine with it.
Interesting.
Yeah. There's really interesting sexual dimorphism for a lot of species where the males and the females behave very differently just based on how they've selected mates. So peacocks, I would guess, the males are going to be really colorful and really loud. For woodpeckers, like being really bright red is an advantage, and then also just being really noisy. Apparently that gets the lady woodpeckers really excited. If anyone has been around chickens and roosters are like super aggressive relative to their size, I guess. Like you wouldn't think that they would be that aggressive, but they don't care who they fight, because if you're more aggressive, you're more likely to secure a mate. So they're just super aggressive with no regard for their own survivability.
I'd never heard that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of times they will basically just fight to the death, the males will, to see who gets to secure all the females. It's more of like a harem style system, which I think gorillas also mate that way.
Really? Gorillas?
I think gorillas do. Maybe someone could correct me on that, but I think there's like an alpha male who basically just beat up all the other ones. Lions are like that too.
Yeah, male lions are supposed to be pretty lazy, right?
They are lazy the vast majority of the time. Like for most of the regular hunts, they don't participate. But if there's ever like a threat to the pride in general, like a pack of hyenas or something, they'll just go ape shit and just kill everything. So
oh damn,
they do have their period where they get activated, but yeah, they're pretty lazy a lot of the time. But the male lions, if they do have control of the pride, that means that they're also in the position where they're getting challenged by up and coming males. So as a male reaches adulthood, they'll try to fight, and if they can unseat the current male lion, then they get the pride. So they actually do have to do a lot of fighting with other lions. So lazy a lot of the time, but not all of the time, to answer the question.
Yeah, gotcha. Understood. So maybe being a lion isn't all it's cracked up to be.
No. It's not just getting to lay and sunbathe and do nothing and have a glorious mane. You have to fight in the jungles.
Are there lions in jungles?
Savannas. No,
Yeah,
I don't think they're really in jungles very much.
Okay.
Yeah. It just sounds cool to say in the jungle, you know?
True. I can see the point. Yeah, I think in jungles it's more like panthers. Is that right?
Yeah, and leopards.
Leopard? Wait, no, not. No, you're thinking of jaguars. I don't think leopards are in jungles either.
Are they not?
Unless I'm mistaken. Maybe Chad knows.
There are snow leopards that are not in jungles.
Oh, okay. I'd associated leopards more with savanna.
I thought leopards were in South America and Latin America. Maybe that's jaguars. Am I messing these up? What's the difference between a leopard and a jaguar?
Well, the leopard is the fast one, right? That's the one that goes like
that's a
faster
cheetah.
than
That's a cheetah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You got me.
Oh, you're thinking about cheetahs this whole time. Gotcha. Yeah, cheetahs are not in jungles. That's true.
There you go. My mistake.
Jaguar and tigers. Leopards are African, jaguars are South American. Okay.
Oh, okay. I did not know that.
Yeah.
We're learning a lot today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at a map of where leopards are. Oh, wow, they're all over the place. Oh, no, they used to be all over the place. Okay. Huh, neat. Okay. So, yeah, they are in jungles. You were right. And specifically, South Asia looks like southern India. leopards, that is, and jaguars, like Chat mentioned elsewhere. But yeah. And my zoological knowledge is more than a little bit dated. Hasn't been something I've studied much in a long time.
Today's Agent Smith, we learned that he's not a zoologist.
Sad but true. Oh, I used to be really into dinosaurs when I was a kid. That was the thing.
Me too. I wanted to grow up and be a stegosaurus one day. Didn't pan out. Just ended up being a normal man.
Didn't have the plates for it, huh?
No, not quite.
Oh gosh, what else did we want to get to?
Did we have a Ukraine update? There were people who asked about it. I know we talked about Bakhmut.
Really not that much. I'm pretty light this week. Let's see. So Emmanuel Macron, that is to say, the president of France, announced that France would start training Ukrainian pilots on the Mirage 2000, which is the main fourth generation fighter that France has. And presumably that's in preparation to actually give them some Mirage 2000s. And the 2000 is kind of a little bit older. I think the Rafale is the most modern fighter that they have. Wait, is the Rafale fifth generation? No, that would be like 4.5 generation, right? Some of you guys are more up to date on that stuff than I am, so I would defer to you on that. But yeah, the Mirage 2000 is relatively modern overall. So if they did give them to Ukraine, that would be a nice boost for them. Mm-hmm. And that did represent a step up in terms of what the West is willing to do for Ukraine, because before they had been pretty reluctant to give modern aircraft. You know, we talked about the F-16 last time. Mm-hmm. So the Mirage 2000 is sort of a comparable class of aircraft. And that was like a week or so before the Biden administration came out and said that they were going to do the same, but for F-16s. So they're going to train Ukrainian pilots on F-16s and eventually, well, they're not going to give them F-16s themselves. The United States will not give, or at least has not committed to give Ukraine any F-16s. But what they have said is that other countries that have F-16s and want to gift them to Ukraine will be able to do so. Washington will allow that going forward. Mm. So it looks like the Ukrainian Air Force is going to be able to field Mirage 2000s and F-16s at some point. So that was a big announcement in the past week, or a couple of big announcements in that sense. Other than that, the grain deal between Russia and Ukraine was extended for 2 months. They're still negotiating that. It's a nice piece of leverage for Moscow. You know, diplomatically speaking, they've been trying to pressure countries in the developing world to not overtly side with Ukraine, or at least to refrain from giving them overt support. And so the grain deal is one of the tools in their diplomatic toolkit by which they do that. So there may not be a long-running grain agreement for that reason. They may prefer to renew it every couple of months, just so that they can threaten to not renew it, mm-hmm. and try to intimidate countries in the developing world. Let's see. And then there was this weird South Africa thing. So there was supposedly a cargo ship that was being loaded with weapons that were allegedly going to be shipped to Russia. And the U.S. ambassador to South Africa apparently heard something or read something or was told something that indicated that the South African government was actively involved in that. In other words, that the South African government was actively selling weapons to Russia and was helping ship those weapons to Russia to help in their war against Ukraine. And so the ambassador came out and said as much, and made some allegations, and basically got in a bunch of trouble when it came out later that actually South Africa's government rather was not involved in that, and that the ship was not in fact involved in shipping weapons. So he had to issue an apology over that. However, in general, the U.S. remains pretty skeptical about South Africa's policy on Ukraine, because the South African government has been not really very supportive of Ukraine overall. They've tended to kind of prevaricated in terms of which side they support, and in so much as they've tried to be involved at all, which hasn't been that much, they've generally tried to paint themselves as a potential mediator. Yeah, that's something I've seen with the other BRICS countries. Brazil, well, not Russia, but Brazil, China, India, South Africa, China as well. So all of them have tried to mediate in the conflict to one degree or another at this point. And, unsurprisingly, all of them have failed. The conflict is not ongoing due to a lack of potential impartial mediators. It's ongoing because
We
of
just
the
need
actors
a
involved.
nice person to hold a meeting for us, and we can resolve this, but we haven't been able to find a mediator. And then this person in the news in some random country said that they need to have peace talks, and that's just the step we needed. Yeah, pretty silly. You did teach me a new word. I just looked it up. Prevaricate, which means to speak or act in an evasive way. Prevaricate. Thank you for teaching me a new word.
No problem. Thank you for teaching me the correct definition. I thought it meant being ambiguous.
It's kind of the same thing.
Similar, but not exactly the same.
Being ambiguous would allow you to be evasive and not really picking a side.
Yeah. So the South African government has been getting some pressure from the United States to try to be more supportive of Ukraine and its cause. And the South African government obviously does not want to do that, doesn't really want to get involved, and really it only wants to be involved in so much as either involvement would benefit it, or if the South African government can try to build international capital by being seen to play a role in mediating some kind of peace agreement. And it seems like neither of those things is happening thus far. And so as a result, they're just kind of taking a back seat to this thing. Yeah, it's kind of a microcosm of the relations between the United States and a lot of countries in the developing world right now, as far as Ukraine. A lot of them have come under pressure from the U.S. To try to be more supportive, but they themselves and their governments not interested. They do not. We've talked about it before, but just to kind of reiterate the point, most of the developing world does not see the conflict in Ukraine as a conflict that affects them. It's not their problem. It's a regional conflict that is well beyond their interest. It's not something they need to pay attention to.
Yeah,
So
well,
all of
it's
these,
a geographical push by Russia to the west, which is obviously going to be much more alarming to anyone who is in a country that is to the west of Russia than to someone who's like in India or something.
Yeah, exactly. So if you live in Africa or Latin America, then you don't have to care, basically. There is some reason, there is an argument to care, in so much as Russia invading Ukraine could set the precedent that big countries can kind of throw their weight around. But of course, the counter argument is, of course, they could already do that, so it's not really much of a precedent in that sense. And even if they wanted to send a message to try to break that precedent by supporting Ukraine, it probably wouldn't stop, say, the United States or China or another major power from throwing their weight around in different circumstances. So why incur the cost then of alienating Russia, a potential partner in trade or other endeavors, when they can just keep the status quo? They can keep those relations going and not have to worry. And again, there's no cost in doing so. It doesn't affect international precedent really one way or the other, according to this logic. So better to just maintain relations and continue making money as before.
Yeah, for the U.S., there's also just the historical factor of the Soviet Union being the main opponent of them for a long period of time. So Russia is kind of the descendant of that in a sense.
That's true.
So for the U.S. to be more opposed to Russia makes a lot of sense. Like I think my parents, maybe your parents too, were kind of growing up during the Cold War, so that whole thing makes us more skeptical of Russia and distrusting. So when we see Russia bullying a neighboring country, then that's gonna be like, see, we were right all along.
Well, that would be more the public's perspective,
Hmm.
and not even all of the public. The United States is a big country. We have a lot of different factions, different perspectives, including on the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you are describing a lot of older folks probably who were already pretty skeptical of Russia. Mitt Romney was kind of the case in point there. When he was running for president back in 2012, he kind of came out and said that Russia was a rival of the United States and a major strategic threat.
Mm-hmm.
Some people look back on that and say he was quite prescient, but I don't give him credit for that. Not because I don't like him, but I just disagree with the idea that Russia was a major strategic threat to the United States in 2012. It wasn't. It's really not even now. A strategic threat would require much greater power than Russia has available to it.
Mm-hmm.
China at least has that. You can consider China a strategic threat. They have the capacity to strategically threaten U.S. interests. Russia really does not.
Mm-hmm.
So American interest in the conflict is more about the international order, so to speak, and the sense of obligation a lot of leaders in Washington have towards it.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond that, there's not a lot of direct U.S. interests that are really at stake beyond, say, the security commitment that the United States has towards Europe. In so much as Russian aggression and the war in Ukraine is indicative of a renewed threat from Russia to European nations, then the United States does have a vested interest in that sense, since we are on the hook to defend them if there were a conflict between them and, say, Russia.
Mm-hmm.
But I would just be careful about the wording there, because there's going to be a lot of Russians that, especially Russian nationalists, the sort of Vatnik community, who very much think that the United States is obsessed with Russia and thinks constantly of how to undermine the country and how to destroy it and secretly control it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case. Like, if anything, the United States has been very ignorant and negligent of Eastern Europe and Russia in particular over the past 10 to 20 years. So it's not so much, evil genius stroking a cat in Washington, thinking up ways to destroy Russia. Rather, it's been just more people barely thinking about it at all. Most of the focus in Washington's foreign policy establishment has been on either the Middle East, in the war on terror, sort of in the aughts, and then later more on China and other regions of the world. And I think in general, one of the reasons the war happened in the first place is because the United States did not sufficiently commit one way or the other to Ukraine's defense. If we had made a strong security commitment to defend Ukraine, or to do more to put them in a position where they were in a stronger position to defend themselves, that probably would have deterred a Russian invasion.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, we could have just not given them aid and just made it either explicitly clear or made it clear in private conversation that the United States would not actually do anything if Russia invaded, or otherwise, tried to control the country from afar. That's another thing. Russia could have controlled Ukraine just through espionage and subterfuge and, the usual forms of spycraft that they're actually probably quite good at. They chose, purposely the more dramatic option because they thought it would be sexier and would generate more public support.
Mm-hmm.
So, a bridge too far, it seems. That's very much a risk reward that blew up in their faces. But regardless, the United States also played its role there. We should have made our policy much more clear, much more early on, and that would have avoided a conflict, most likely. But again, the reason I pointed out is just to make clear that no, Americans do not consider Russia like some great historical enemy, in so much as people are skeptical of Russia. In so much as there's a legacy of skepticism towards Russia from the Cold War, it manifests more as just a general uneasiness, like a sense that Russia cannot be entirely trusted, that it's an authoritarian country, etc. But beyond that, the enmity is not much deeper than that. Like, people don't hate Russia in the United States, and they don't see Russia as a rival, certainly not a peer rival. Uh, again, attention has been elsewhere. Like, China has had a much more dramatic impact on the United States just by way of economic dislocation caused by free trade. So in that sense, there's a much closer relationship with China, in so much as it's seen as having directly impacted the lives of many Americans in a way that Russia just has not, like, in a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah, so in terms of like military rival, Russia was the closest thing that the US has had, and we've talked before about the power of their propaganda machine and how effective it is in
Yeah.
making people concerned even if they don't actually have uh, the same level of
Oh, yeah.
military competence as the US. Like, we absolutely thought that they did, which was part of why the Ukraine war was such a surprise and it being a mess. It's like we thought that it was going to be a walkover victory, kind of like Iraq, but it really wasn't. And it wasn't necessarily because all of the soldiers and stuff were bad. It's more so just that the whole operation was a lot less clean and disciplined as it needs to be for things to run smoothly in that sense. And if you if you haven't had a conventional war like that in a while, you're not really in the best practice to test it. So it's definitely been interesting. But yeah, China's more of the economic peer that the U.S. is watching and wanting to make sure that, in the national pride sense, we stay number one, economically speaking.
Well, it's more of a preventive thing. I don't know that people really care that much about staying number one economically. It's more about the fact that having a large economy inherently means that a state has much greater capacity to influence regional, if not world, events.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, China has an immense amount of capacity, getting close to the level of the United States in terms of projecting force and influence beyond its borders.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, the United States is trying to kind of get ahead of that. Right now, China has not really projected a whole lot of influence beyond its borders, but they have the latent potential to do so. And that potential grows with their economy.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to ensure that influence is not used for ends that are averse to US interests or Western interests, the United States in particular, and the West more broadly, has increasingly taken the initiative in trying to establish policies, positions, alliances that will act as deterrents. In other words, that will act as a deterrent to China doing anything in that vein.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't always know what I'm going to say before I say it. Sometimes it's more stream of consciousness, so I worry sometimes about coherence.
Yeah, and if we got anything wrong, chat, feel free to yell at us in the YouTube comments or in Twitch chat, because he reads it after. We love our scathing reviews and your insightful commentary.
Yeah, feedback is definitely appreciated. Let's see, are you doing okay on time?
Yeah, we'll probably wrap up after this game or so.
All right. Well, I did have a couple weird news items, so maybe that's not a bad way to end it.
Sure, we always like those.
Let me see if I can find them here. Oh, did you hear the story about the Dutch sperm donor?
No.
Would you like to?
Maybe. What happened?
Well, let's see. So in the Netherlands, there's a legal limit on the number of children you can father as a sperm donor, right? So the limit is that 25 children among 12 families is the most you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And they have that cap in place because they don't want too many children running around in the same community with a common genetic background, basically. Mm-hmm. So that rule's in place, and somebody, some John Doe, broke the rule very purposely. Like, it was very clear that he wanted to father lots of children, and he was actually discovered to have been doing this, and he was banned from donating to fertility clinics in 2017 after it emerged that he had fathered more than 100 children.
Whoa.
However, he did not stop. He actually carried on donating sperm both abroad and online. And as a result, he ended up fathering a total of about 550 children. Now
What?
he's been he's been fined about 100,000 euros. No, he could be fined more than 100,000 euros if he tries again. He's 41 years old, so he's kind of getting up there, but he could do it again. And the courts have said, if we catch you doing this again, we're going to fine the shit out of you.
How? I guess the question is, why do people want this dude's stuff?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe he's just got really good credentials. Maybe he's very attractive, but whatever it is, there's something magic about this man's sperm.
That's pretty silly. I didn't know about the limit, but it does make sense. If you have overrepresentation, then you also open up vulnerability to certain complications. So,
Yeah. Well, he's got roughly large company's worth of offspring to show for it. So, seems to be working out for him.
it's pretty funny. I think you do get paid for that, so he's probably getting close to break even if he does end up getting fined.
Yeah, I don't think this guy's about the money, Neuro. I think this guy is an enthusiast.
Oh, a hobbyist, if you will.
Yeah. That's a thing. Some guys just really like the idea of impregnating women, and they want to donate their sperm. They want their offspring out there for whatever reason.
I just feel like it would be really awkward later on when people just show up at your door and they're like, "Hi, I think you're my father," and you're like, sort of.
I don't know. I feel like this guy would probably be more proud than anything.
Yeah, it could be.
I suspect this guy has a very eccentric personality, if I had to guess. So if his offspring did actually meet him, the encounter would probably be nothing if not unpredictable, shall we say.
Yeah, that's true. So he's probably a weird customer with a strange fixation on something. Chad is saying that it'll be really awkward for people who will grow up and they'll be teenagers or young adults, and then they'll date each other and then find out they have the same dad and they have to call it off. That'll be really annoying.
Well, you don't have to, but yeah.
Well, you should.
Yeah. Well, technically, it's only half of the what is it? The DNA, right? Half comes from the father, half from the mother.
Yeah.
So that's not as much of a problem as, say, full blood. But yes, yeah. Case in point.
Yeah.
Well, no, not case in point. I would agree. Basically, yeah, you would have to break it off, basically, for genetic reasons.
There's Chad saying in Iceland there's an app to check if you're related to someone. Interesting.
Really? Oh, yeah, that's right. Because the population's so small.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they even break a million. What is it, like a 250,000 population there?
Googling population of Iceland.
Yeah, thereabouts. Not too much more.
Yeah, 372,100,000. Over a third of a
Very
million.
few.
Wow, Alaska has more people than that? Alaska has like 2/3.
To be fair, it's much bigger.
Yeah, but it's cold as fuck, no?
Well, I mean, bigger also means like more resources. They've got the oil deposits way up around Prudhoe Bay. So that alone probably attracts a lot more people. And then all of the infrastructure and the maintenance thereof probably attracts a lot of people. So, yeah, I can believe it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's see. State population ranking USA. States by population. Here we go. Where is Alaska? Just show this on stream. We've got California with 39 mil, Texas with 29.5, Florida with 22, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Georgia, North Carolina. These all have over 10 million. And then, let's see, where is Alaska? No. What is your favorite meal of the day? Alaska is ranked 49. And that
Pretty low.
Yeah. Damn, the U.S. state populations is high. Rhode Island has 1 million people. What the hell?
Providence.
Yeah, that's like a city. Oh, it puts Puerto Rico at 31. 3.2 mil.
Yeah.
Almost 3.3.
Yeah, it's more than most states in the West.
Mm-hmm. Washington is 7.7 million. Yeah, Texas number 2. Hawaii's 41, 1.4 million. South Dakota and North Dakota, pretty low pop.
Oh, yeah.
Under 1 million for each of those. They're right next to Alaska.
Great Plains states.
Vermont and Wyoming, very sparsely populated. Quick Kukio story before we sign off. When we were driving from Texas to like Surrey, which is near Vancouver originally, we were driving through Wyoming, and it was just nothing except wind, a lot of wind. And then we hit a big snowstorm, and he was pulling in a Ford Ranger truck, which is a pretty small truck. It does have a bed on the back, but he's pulling a big trailer, and the wind and the snow, he just barely swiveled to the side, and then it caused him to completely jackknife around, and the trailer swung out in front of him. I'm following him at a pretty far and safe distance, so I didn't crash into him. I'm just watching him spin out on this road, and he got a huge burst of adrenaline, but he was fine at the end of it. But yeah, Wyoming is a very windy state. There's not a whole bunch there except for other trucks on the highway. And JW in chat is saying, also don't speed. The police need your money.
Yeah, I can believe it.
People are just trying to get through the state to the other side, and the cops are capitalizing. That's funny. Well, cool. Well, appreciate you coming on as always. And chat, thank you for contributing to the conversation. He'll publish the VOD and he can read it after, and I'll put this on YouTube tonight, most likely. As always, if we mess anything up, feel free to correct us in the YouTube comments. Agent Smith, I challenge you this week with a 25-minute walk. We're going to up it by 5 whole minutes, and you can let us know if you had to suffer through that or if it was easy.
Oh, man. Yeah, I did do it this week.
Nice. Good on you.
Today, actually.
Yep. I procrastinate too. Actually, having accountability is really good for getting stuff done, because if you don't, then sometimes you just never do it. So sometimes I'll set a date for something if it's a piece of content that I want to get done, and I haven't even started it yet, and by setting a date, then I actually do it. So that's good, and I hope you enjoy the weather before it gets way too hot in Texas.
Yeah, really.
Yeah.
I'll try. Got to keep that AC maintained.
Yep. Well, I appreciate your expertise and knowledge as always, sir, and we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG. Nice. Be careful in Wyoming.